What's up everyone? Lance Hedrick here, and today I'm going to teach you how to make your espresso taste just so good. Now, it's no secret that espresso is a bit intimidating. There are a lot of variables to take into account, and once you click on Espresso YouTube or Coffee YouTube or Coffee Reddit, wherever you go, there are so many vastly differing opinions on how to approach it. You see things like pressure and flow profiling. You see machines with tablets on top. You see these people having these intense conversations about the amount of hole coverage on the bottom of a basket, and you're thinking, what the heck have I gotten myself into? Well, fret not, because today's video, I'm gonna walk you through the basics. I'm gonna take your hand and we're gonna walk through the different variables of extraction in a very easy to understand way so that you know what effect in your cup any little change on your variables of extraction will have for the taste. Because that's what's most important. We need to understand theory, but it needs to have a pragmatic relation to our daily workflow. If you want, you can make espresso very simple. You can start coarse, grind fine enough so that it hits the pressure and the time that you're wanting to do a typical 1-to-2 ratio. You can just live with that. And if you don't like the taste, it's whatever, you're getting your espresso, and that's fine. It's valid, you can do what you like. But this video is kind of geared towards those who want to improve their espresso a bit. They want to understand a little bit of what they're doing in order to get better and better as time goes on. The groundworks to kind of understand what's going on when we make these changes and how the flavor is affected in the final cup. But the second video will be a bit more theory laden and will be a bit more advanced when we talk about these different types of extraction dynamics. What we're talking about today is what you need to understand about the process, which applies to whatever machine you are on. Now I'm gonna break this video up in a pretty clean way, and I'll have time cues down below. But the way I wanna section this video up is by the 6 variables of extraction. Some we're going to hit on a lot, and some not as much because they're not as applicable to the majority of us. Don't freak out, they're very intuitive. I try to tell people that to an extent, things in coffee are very intuitive. The first one we have is dose. Then we have our ratio. Then we talk about grind size. Then contact time, temperature, and pressure. Now, as we go forward in the video, I may not do them in that order, but we're gonna talk about them as they pop up intuitively so that it's easier to understand, easier to follow. Now, the first thing we're gonna talk about today is our dose. The dose refers to the amount of coffee we're putting into our basket right here in the portafilter. This has been discussed in terms of grams, the weight of it, which makes sense. People will take a precision scale that's accurate up to 0.1 of a gram, and they will weigh it so they know exactly how much is going in. So anytime they make a change on the grind size or anything along those lines, they are able to maintain a consistency across that weight or that dose. That makes a lot of sense. But in reality, it can also cause some confusion. It is important to understand that you need to look at the volume of the basket. There's kind of an ideal amount of coffee that will go into each basket depending on its size or its bed depth. That distance between the top of the puck and the bottom of the screen, the shower screen on your machine, is a very important thing to take into account. You don't want to underfill because then you can get a really thin type of extractant, something that is lacking body and has a different extraction dynamic than if you were to overfill it, where that screen is pressed into that puck and is causing a lot of channeling because you're not really giving any space for the water column to build up for an even press through the puck. So there's a happy middle space where the screen is not too far from the puck top and the screen is not pressed into the surface of the puck. Oftentimes you'll see baskets are rated based off of their grams. It'll be like an 18-gram basket or a 19-gram basket, 20, etc. Some have ranges, 17 to 19-gram baskets. All of these, I understand what they're doing, but overall they're not that helpful because different varieties of coffee, different roast levels of coffee, they all have different densities and will take up varying amounts of volume based on weight. Okay, so Lance, how do I find the dose? You're telling me don't use a scale. Well, would you use a spoon? What do you want me to do? Listen, it's not voodoo. What kind of voodoo do you do? Oh, yeah. What? Instead, there's a very simple way to know if you have the proper puck depth. Fill it up, tamp it down, put it in. Then we're gonna pull it out without starting it. We're gonna look at the top of the puck. And if there's a screw indent, assuming your machine has a screw coming out of it, we have too much coffee in there. Now, if you don't have a screw, if you have like an E61 machine, you put it in, you pull it out, and there is the pattern of the screen is on top, or it's kind of been messed up by the screen, well, then you have too much coffee. You do not want contact between the puck of coffee and your screen above. You need there to be some clearance there so that there's water that can fill up the space in order to have a water column pushing through. You don't want the direct contact from the screen to the puck because that can cause a lot of channeling. So it's difficult to know if you've underfilled because, this is why I say to overfill first in order to slowly take out coffee until you hit that perfect depth. Breville has actually made a really nifty tool years ago called the razor, and this is actually to help you find that perfect depth with every coffee. Essentially with the razor, you put it into it and you twist it, and if it touches the bed, you have too much coffee. If the level of coffee is well below the bottom of this razor tool, you have too little coffee. You essentially want to fill up to where it's just barely grazing the surface, and that's the perfect puck depth according to the Breville team. You will notice if you have an underfilled basket that the body or the texture will be a little bit less or weaker than if you were to have the proper amount. So you want to ensure that you have the proper headspace in order to optimize what a lot of people look for in espresso, which is that thick, syrupy body. If you don't have a scale, okay, you'll just have to remember exactly where optically that level is, or if you're using scoops or something, you know the exact amount, because we need to ensure that we're being consistent with our dose in. If we're not consistent with our dose, then it's going to be very difficult to dial in because we need to have some constant variables in order to make tweaks and not go crazy. Now, if you're relying on weight, that is still okay once you find that ideal puck depth, because it's not gonna make massive differences until you get to massive grind size changes, or if you switch beans completely. So once you find that puck depth and it's pulling in a decent shot parameter for what you like, you can make note of that for that coffee and know that is the puck depth for that coffee. You will not get everything right your first try, so don't freak out if you don't, when you don't, all right? Let's calm it down. Also, bed height is going to help you with texture. If the smaller the amount of space is between the top of that puck and the screen, the more texture you'll get in your final cup. If you really underdose, you'll get less texture. So worst case scenario, you could still have an incredibly balanced shot when it comes to taste, but the texture may not be the best. So that's one of the big things we want to think about with dose, and we're going to kind of get that out of the way. That is kind of a constant, so to speak, so that you don't have to worry about the amount of coffee you're putting in. You're more so worrying about grind size, and you're figuring out the depth based off of that with densities and everything along those lines. And if you've been a barista ever, you know that a rush comes in throughout the day, you're changing grind sizes because the humidity, the temperature, all these different things, maybe the hopper is low and so there's less weight pushing down on the beans, which is causing the shots to run faster. You're freaking out. Oh, it's so annoying to mess with dialing in. Okay, yes, it can be a bit chaotic when we're talking about grind size because we're dealing with teeny tiny particles, and a massive amount of those particles when we're talking about number or particle count are these tiny fines that you cannot control. We have our nominal peak, which is kind of the grind size setting we set a grinder to, but the majority of the number of particles will always be these teeny tiny little fines, and that can really throw off what we're doing and can be confusing and can be a little bit frustrating. So grind size is just referring to how big or how small are the particles that you're filling your basket with. Of course, not all the particles are the same size, but we're talking about kind of the average peak. That one is shifting coarser or finer, depending on you opening up your burr aperture or closing your burr aperture, whether you have a cone burr or you have flat burrs, all right? So the bigger the burr aperture, the coarser the grounds. The smaller the burr aperture, the finer the grounds. What does that mean in the basket? Well, the coarser or the wider the burr aperture, the faster the water can flow through. The less density that puck has, the less resistance the machine is going to meet whenever the water is protruding through that bed of grounds. The finer you go, the smaller the particles, the less the space is between the particles, the much more difficult it will be for that water to get through, the much more pressure or the much more resistance that water is going to feel as it's being pushed through, and you're going to have a different extraction dynamic altogether. Phrase that you'll read online, especially in our espresso shout out, is grind finer. And that's because so many people new to espresso will get their machine, they'll get their grinder, and they'll start pulling shots. And they get 10-second shots. It's just flying out. It looks like yellow water. That is actually pretty good advice for most situations. Now, I don't like the advice, but it's because for me, I'm always wanting to grind coarser. But the idea is a lot of people don't realize how fine they need to grind for different types of coffee. different coffees need different doses. They're going to need different grind sizes because they are roasted to different levels, meaning their solubilities are different, meaning their densities are different, meaning their puck integrities are different. So you're going to have to approach each coffee differently. And some of them will require a much finer grind size than other ones in order to hit certain types of recipes. Grinding finer is usually going to get you closer to what you might be looking for if you're looking for a very rigid system like 1 to 2 in 30 seconds, meaning I have a 20 gram dose, I need 40 gram yield, and I need it in 30 seconds. Put in a 20 gram dose and keep messing with that grind size until you get that exact 30-second shot, and that's fine. But that's not exactly what we want to talk about here. Instead, we want to talk about the exact effect grind size is going to have on taste. Let's say you've got that 20 in, 40 out in 30 seconds, and you're tasting it. I like the balance, I like the acidity level, I like the sweetness level, but it's muddied on my palate. Well, that's likely because you're grinding too fine. Grinding too fine can result in muddied cups. It can result in skewed extractions, meaning you pull back-to-back shots and maybe they pull at the same time each, but they taste vastly different. That water, the more difficult it is to push through the puck, the more likely you're going to experience channeling. Maybe experiencing a lot of tiger striping, which is essentially fines that have made their way through microfines and particles, cellulose fibers, cell walls, things like that have found their way through, which can cause an extremely bitter reaction. And you might have kind of a grimy taste because you're getting a lot of particles through that are going to cause astringency and kind of an acrid taste in your mouth. So grinding finer is not necessarily always the greatest thing. Instead of doing that, you may go, it's sour, which is hinting at under extraction. So maybe I do need to increase my surface area, but I don't like the mouthfeel. So counterintuitively, I need to go coarser. That might improve that muddied experience and give me a bit more clarity, or will give me a bit more texture that is not as rough on my tongue. So that means I need to think of other variables of extraction to increase my extraction and not rely just on grind size. Every change that modulates extraction will affect extraction differently, and that's what I'm trying to talk about here. You don't always need to hit 9 bar the whole time. You don't always need to have an extremely pressurized shot. You don't need to hit these things because, well, guess what? The reason 9 bar was so important back then is because the coffee was so low quality. They were the number one reason to drink it was the texture. So they needed that high pressure, slower drip through so it wasn't runny and thin and bitter and diluted. Now with coffees, they're nowhere near as thick as they used to be unless you're buying those specific coffees or those specific roasts, which they're definitely still available if you get a super dark roasted Robusta that's really freshly roasted. But for everything else, you don't need to worry about it nearly as much. We're going for dialing into our exact preferences. If you want a more clean shot, coarsen the grind up. If you want the intensity of the acidity to be a bit higher, coarsen the grind up a bit. These things can help you traverse your way through without having to be a bit scatterbrained on, okay, what change do I need to make in order to affect this change in the final cup? Going finer could increase your extraction, but could also decrease it because guess what? You may be getting to a point where it's so finely packed together, the water just can't go through all the coffee, so it picks channels and it under extracts. That's not across the board an easy fix. Going coarser can increase extraction a lot of times. So that is not as clear cut as ratio. More water will always extract more. Less water relative to the previous one will always extract less. Guess what, Lance? I have the perfect dose. It doesn't have that screw indent. I have the perfect grind size. I'm hitting 9 bar. I've got my ratio. It's 20 in, 40 out, 30 seconds. I like the texture, but it's sour. Instead of 20 in, 40 out, maybe try 20 in, 45 out. The more you increase your extraction, the more you're able to extract, the less the sourness will be as prevalent. When you're extracting coffee, you kind of go from sour to sweet to bitter. This is not chemically accurate. There are different compounds that come out throughout it. But if you were to kind of separate a shot, pull a shot of espresso, in the first 10 seconds, you take out the extractant. Second 10 seconds, you take out the extractant. Third 10 seconds, you take out the extractant. You get where I'm going. Then you taste each one. The first one will be incredibly sour. The second one will be kind of like sort of sweet, but it won't have that much bitterness or that much sourness. The third one will be really watery and have a drying sensation on your tongue. 20 and 45 out might be good, but maybe 20 and 50 out might be good. What you could do is you can pull your shot, don't click stop on your machine, take your cup and switch it for another one for the last 5 grams and stop it. Stir up the 45 gram shot, take a little sip and say, is that the balance I'm looking for? Do I have all of that, sweetness, all the bitterness, all the sourness, whatever it all is? So you don't have to waste coffee to pull another shot at 50 grams, take that extra 5 grams and toss it in, stir it up and give it a sip. Because that's what it would have pulled anyway, right? So instead of wasting it, you're just gonna use that, separate it before it actually gets in and give it a taste. The concentration is essentially given through your ratio. If you want a really thick, sludgy shot, do a 1-to-1 ratio, very tiny ratio. Granted, you're going to have a pretty sour shot unless you're using like charcoal dark roast where there's not much acidity present to begin with. There's a lot of acidity in the coffee, just the presentation is not very intense. If you push to a 1-to-5 ratio, it's gonna be very watery. And that's because as coffee is extracting, there's an inverse relationship between the concentration. So at the beginning, you have a high concentration of coffee coming out and a low concentration of water. Hello, thickness, yo. That's why it's coming out so thick. But as it keeps going, the amount of coffee that can be extracted is decreasing. So the viscosity is lessening. So as you go, they're switching in concentration. The concentration of water increases rapidly and more rapidly, and coffee is decreasing. And so you see the color go from a dark red or a dark brown into a lighter brown into like a blonde type of yellow color. And at the end, it's almost a translucent yellow if you just kept running it for 200 grams or however much you want to run for funsies. The temperature is also going to increase because that puck is no longer capable of taking away a lot of that heat. So it's just going straight through the puck and into your cup and increasing the temperature. You know, this is pretty good, but I wish it had more body. It's got pretty good structure, but I wish it was thicker. You know, I wish it was thicker. Lessen your ratio. Of course, now you're going to have to do something else in order to fix the lower extraction, because maybe now that you've lowered the ratio, maybe now it's sour. And so you need to think, okay, it's sour now. So how can I get the sour out without increasing the ratio? What can I do there? Well, one thing you could do is go a finer grind and allow a longer extraction time. This may introduce some other issues, which we'll talk about next with contact time, but that is a way that you can go about doing it. Another way going about doing it is you can change your basket size and have a different dose. Different depths of bed can improve your body. That's why with these new levers that are made in Naples that are, still targeted towards a darker roasted audience, that's why they come with these triple baskets that can hold like 25 grams of coffee. You grind really coarse, you have a really deep puck, and boom, you get some thick crema. You need to make sure you're getting the coffee that's going to fit the style of shots that you want. Let's say a Gaggia Classic Pro at home, you're not gonna be able to buy a super lightly roasted coffee and do 1-to-1 shots. They will never taste good. Unless you're hacking it with some crazy long pre-infusion by doing the poor man's pre-infusion, and you're doing like 60-second shots where you're doing a really long pre-infusion to allow a lot of blooming, to allow a lot of saturation so that extraction is more efficient. So you need to buy coffee towards the style of shots you want to do. You're not always gonna be able to make any coffee taste any way you want with standard equipment. Now, of course, with higher quality grinders and with machines with more capabilities, you can do more of these things. You can pull a 1-to-1.5 ratio of a really lightly roasted coffee, but it's gonna take some more of this advanced knowledge that we can discuss in a later video. Pulling coffee and you're worrying too much about time, it can be a red herring. You need to focus on the other ones that have much more grave on their effects in the final cup, that we can actually touch in the final cup. You could still have an insane texture with a 60-second shot. You can have terrible texture with a 60-second shot. You can have no bitterness with a 60-second shot. You can also have insane bitterness with a 60-second shot. There's not nearly as much 1-to-1 correlation when it comes to contact time. Time is something that it can be looked at later and you can go, okay, maybe the reason this is all having this bitter finish is because it is taking 45 seconds. So maybe I do need to tweak something like grind size, make it a little coarser so it comes through faster, but I'll keep the ratio the same. I'll keep the puck depth the same. I just need to increase the dose a bit because I'm going a lot coarser in order to allow a faster draw through. But contact time is really gonna be one of those things that you're just finely tweaking. And honestly, you can't change the time without changing other things. I'll link below a paper for those nerds of you that want to look at a recent publication by Dr. Samo Smrke where he does some, looking at volatile organic compounds over time with espresso, but we won't get into it in this video. I prefer mostly that people just forget completely about time and work on the other things. Now, the last two variables, I'm just gonna kind of conflate together because I don't want to spend much time on them. Most machines don't have the capability of changing temperature or pressure. All I'm gonna say about temperature is the higher the temperature, the more readily capable that water is of getting in the grounds and being aggressive with the extraction. The lower the water, the less. if you have the capability of changing up or down, that if you're using a dark roasted coffee, something with oil on it, go as low of temperature as you can. If you can go down to like 85 degrees, that's great, do that. If you're using a really lightly roasted coffee, maybe go to the higher end of that spectrum, above 90 degrees ideally. It's a very difficult thing for people to change. Most people don't have the capability of changing in temperature, so I wouldn't really sweat it. Pressure. Very few people can change the pressure unless you're changing your OPV or you're changing something inside your machine, or if you have a flow profile machine or a pressure profile machine, which tend to be a bit more expensive. So 9 bar is the standard. No one has still made a good argument as to why 9 is the exact standard. I would be very impressed if people could tell the difference between a 9 and 7 bar shot, and I don't worry about maintaining pressure through a shot. Unless you're grinding so finely that it can maintain 9 bar, it likely won't maintain 9 bar. As the water is going through and eroding the puck, there's less resistance necessarily. A lot of that puck is entering your cup. So there's less matter between the water, the shower screen, and your cup. Because of that, the resistance is becoming less and less. Unless you grind so fine that even when it's fully eroded, it can still give you that pressure to maintain 9 bar, it's going to lose pressure. I would actually prefer for that pressure to decrease because that's telling me I'm not grinding so finely that at the beginning I'm likely getting a ton of channels. And then if it's channeling a ton, then you're likely going to have worse channeling as the shot goes on because you ground so finely that it's able to maintain 9 bar even when 20% of that puck is eroded, which means it's pushing through at such a high pressure that it's likely creating more and more channels as it's going through. A lot of people want to push back on the existence of channels. They are objectively true. I don't know what to tell you. They may come and go quickly, but depending on your puck preparation, depending on your coffees and everything like that, there can be a lot of issues, especially with the lighter that you go. For those of you that like really darkly roasted coffee, I've got great news. It'll be much easier to dial in your coffee, and it'll look like you're channel free, and it'll taste very similar shot to shot. Bad news for those of you who like lightly roasted coffees. There's going to be a lot more volatility and variability between shot to shot because the puck integrity is a lot lower and there's a lot more places for the shot to go wrong based off of a myriad of reasons. One being you have to grind a lot finer with lighter roasted coffees, which is going to increase the potential for the channeling. A lot coarser for darker because they're a lot more soluble. It has a much more inherent puck integrity and they'll produce more fines, which also gives more puck integrity. We talked about the 6 variables of extraction, and I don't really remember the order very well, but we talked about dose. We talked about having the ideal dose for a basket, so depending on which basket size you have, well, don't go off the grams on it, go based off your coffee and fill it up. Go over, fill up too much, tamp it down, and take away coffee until, boom, there's no more indent of a screen or of a screw, and you're good to go on that dose. Now you may need to change the dose as you change the second variable, which is your grind size. The finer the grounds, well, the more dense your puck, likely you'll need to add some more coffee. The coarser the grounds, the fatter your puck, the less coffee you'll need in there. And this is going to dictate muddiness or clarity in your cup of coffee. It's also going to dictate some of that strength. I always prefer to go coarser than go finer and finer. The finer you go, the more potential for astringent compounds to release and to get into your final cup. Also, the finer you go, the more potential for channeling. So finer is not always better. Grind finer in the beginning if you're going too coarse, sure, but finer and finer is a no-no. Next up, we're talking about that ratio. Lower ratio, thicker body. Higher ratio, thinner body. Lower ratio, lower extraction. Higher ratio, higher extraction. It's objective, it's simple, it's easy to remember. This is going to help you stretch out your extractions without having to change other variables, keep the same dose, keep the same grind size. You taste a shot, it's too thin. Well, just lessen the ratio. And if as long as it doesn't come out sour and it's tasting good, well, guess what? You just got a thicker body. The extraction's lower, sure, but as long as it's still balanced, you're good to go. Now, if you're tasting it, you're going, oh my goodness, it's watery, it's bitter, it's drying. Well, you can lower it as well because that's probably over extraction. If you're tasting it, you're going, oh, this is sour. Well, push the extraction by just increasing that ratio. Now, the next step that we talked about was time and how it's largely a red herring, that you should break the rules. Don't worry about those 30-second limits or 20-second too low. Focus on the other 3 first, and then you can worry about time. Then we talk about temperature and pressure, which for the most part, we don't really need to worry about because most machines don't have these capabilities. But when we're talking about temperature, higher temperature for lighter roast, lower temperature for darker roast, and they're largely going to help you stave off bitterness by going lower. If you get a lot of bitterness, go lower temperature. If you have a really light roast that needs more help with extraction and you're not able to get a higher extraction with some of these other things without compromising, then go higher temperature. Last thing is pressure, and guess what? Most people can't change their pressure, but if you want to, you can. that is everything. That is all that we need to talk about. Thank you for pushing through. I would greatly appreciate a like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. I also do a lot of content on my Instagram that's very helpful, a lot more nerdy stuff there. I also have a Patreon I would love if you would check out, where I do competitions for people to win all the machines that I buy using Patreon funds, giving away currently 3 64mm grinders. I'm gonna do competitions for like 50 more things or more. I have so much to share with you all. But the link for that is also down below, and it's also connected to a sweet, lively Discord that I'm a part of, my own personal Discord, and it's a lot of fun. I hope that this is helpful, and I hope that using these themes, these theories, these pragmatics, that you are able to brew something tasty today. And cheers.